Life in our quiet town was predictable, almost idyllic. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where neighbors waved from their porches, and life moved at a comfortable, unhurried pace. Growing up there, I always imagined my life unfolding in the same steady rhythm. School, a good job, marriage, maybe some kids, and growing old in the same town that raised me. And for a long time, it felt like I was on track for exactly that. As a kid, trust seemed simple. You trusted your friends to keep your secrets, your family to have your back, and your neighbors to return your tools. But that belief cracked for the first time when I was 11. My best friend, Danny, stole from me. It was a small thing, a silver pocket knife my grandfather gave me, but it cut deep. When I confronted him, he denied it with a straight face. A week later, I saw it clipped to his belt as he showed it off to other kids. I never got the knife back, but I learned something important. Trust is fragile. Those lessons stuck with me, shaping how I saw the world as I grew older. By the time I reached high school, I had become more guarded, choosing my friends carefully and always keeping a part of myself in reserve. Still, despite the occasional letdown, I believed in the value of relationships. That belief carried me through college and into adulthood, where I worked hard to build a stable life. I became a civil engineer, a profession that appealed to my love of structure and problem-solving. It felt rewarding to create something tangible, something that would last. My work gave me purpose, and my growing reputation in the field brought a sense of pride. But the real highlight of my life came when I met Aysel. Aysel had this magnetic presence, warm, smart, and always the center of attention without even trying. I was captivated from the start. We met at a mutual friend's wedding, and she laughed at one of my awkward jokes about the food. That laugh. It was pure sunshine. By the end of the night, we were sitting on the steps outside the venue, talking about everything from travel dreams to our favorite childhood memories. I knew, even then, that she was someone I could spend my life with. Our relationship moved quickly, but it felt right. Within a year, we were married. Aysel brought light and spontaneity into my otherwise measured life. She encouraged me to take risks, to explore new hobbies, to loosen the reins on my meticulously planned days. We were different in many ways, but those differences seemed to complement each other. Or so I thought. Looking back, it's almost laughable how blind I was to the early signs. At the time, I saw our relationship as solid, unshakable. But cracks have a way of hiding in plain sight, blending into the surface until something, or someone, forces them open. The first hint of trouble came in the form of Timur. He wasn't just my best friend. He was practically family. We met during our early career days, both young and hungry to make something of ourselves. Together, we co-founded a small engineering firm that grew into a respected company in our region. Timur was everything I wasn't: charismatic, bold, and always the life of the party. If I built the walls, Timur painted them with vibrant colors. Aysel and Timur got along well, which didn't surprise me. He had a way of charming everyone, and I was glad to see her warm to him. At first, I felt lucky. My wife and my best friend were two of the most important people in my life, and they genuinely seemed to like each other. It never crossed my mind to question their closeness. My parents used to say that life is like a house. You can build it strong, with solid foundations, but even the sturdiest house can collapse if you don't take care of it. At the time, I thought I was doing everything right. Providing for Aysel, supporting her dreams, and maintaining a home where we could both thrive. But I was about to learn a hard truth. Sometimes, the cracks in the foundation aren't the ones you create. Sometimes, they come from the people you trust the most. For now, my life seemed full. A successful career, a wife I adored, and a best friend I trusted like a brother. But if you've ever stood in a quiet house and felt the faintest shudder under your feet, you'll know what I mean when I say there were tremors beneath the surface. At the time, I brushed them off as nothing. A moment of tension here, a sharp comment there, Aysel's distracted look when she thought I wasn't watching. They were so small, so insignificant, that I convinced myself they didn't matter. But they did. And soon, those tremors would shake everything apart. The first signs of change in Aysel weren't dramatic. No sudden outbursts or obvious signs of unhappiness, but the small things started adding up. Her usual warmth and energy began to fade, replaced by a cool distance I couldn't quite explain. It started when she began working later than usual. I'd ask about her day, and she'd give vague answers, brushing me off with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe she was just busy. It happens to everyone, right? Isel's career was taking off. She was managing a growing team, and the pressures were mounting. But as the weeks turned into months, that busy feeling didn't seem to let up. Her smiles became fewer, and our conversations, once easy and full of laughter, started to feel forced. We went to bed at different times, and when we were in the same room, she seemed distracted, her mind elsewhere. It wasn't just her work life that was different. At home, she started avoiding eye contact when we spoke, her body language closing off when I sat beside her. She'd leave for errands and take longer than she ever had before, sometimes returning without explanation, claiming traffic or a forgotten stop. I wanted to believe her, but deep down, I knew something wasn't adding up. One night, I decided to confront her. It had been building up for weeks, the nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach that something was off. I waited until we were alone, sitting on the couch after dinner. I didn't want to make a scene, but I couldn't let it go any longer. "Isel, is everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, not wanting to accuse her outright. She glanced at me, her eyes flicking away almost immediately. "What do you mean?" Her voice was flat, almost indifferent. She seemed more distant than ever. "You've been different lately. I don't know how to explain it, but I feel like I'm losing you. We barely talk anymore. You've been coming home late, and when you do, you don't even seem to want to be here," I said, my heart pounding as I said the words I had been avoiding. Isel shifted uncomfortably, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. "It's just work, okay? You know how stressful things have been. You're overthinking it." I wanted to believe her, I really did. But I knew her too well. Isel wasn't someone who brushed things off like that. She was passionate, animated, always eager to share the details of her day. This wasn't her. "You've been distant with me, and I just need to understand why. Am I doing something wrong?" I asked, my voice quieter now, a hint of desperation slipping through. I wasn't used to feeling vulnerable like this, but I couldn't ignore the pain gnawing at me anymore. She sighed, an exasperated sound that hit me harder than it should have. "It's not you, okay? It's just everything else. I'm trying to keep it together. I don't have the energy for this right now," she said, standing up abruptly, her hands running through her hair. I sat there, watching her walk away, and for the first time in our relationship, I felt like a stranger in my own home. She didn't come back for a while, and I found myself staring at the empty space where she had been sitting. The silence felt deafening, and all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart, the weight of unanswered questions hanging heavy in the air. The next few weeks followed a similar pattern. We went through the motions of daily life, but the connection between us kept slipping further and further away. I tried to talk to her again, but each time I brought up the distance, she would dismiss it, or worse, become defensive. "Stop questioning me," she would say, "I'm fine." But I could see the cracks, no matter how hard she tried to hide them. Then, one night, everything changed. I had been out of town for a work trip, just for a few days, but when I returned, something felt off. Isel wasn't there when I got home, and the house was eerily quiet. I texted her, asking where she was, but there was no response for hours. This wasn't like her. She was always quick to answer, even if she was busy. When she finally came home late that evening, her face was flushed, and her eyes avoided mine like they always did lately. My stomach churned with unease, but I couldn't quite place why. "Where have you been?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice betrayed me, tight and full of suspicion. Isel froze at the door, then shrugged as if it was no big deal. "Just out. With some friends." "Friends?" I repeated, my brow furrowing. "Who?" "You didn't even tell me you were going out." She shot me an irritated look. "I didn't think I needed to. It was just a last-minute thing. Don't make this a big deal." I could feel the heat rising in my chest, anger and fear mixing together. Something wasn't right. "Isel, you're avoiding me." You're avoiding this relationship. And now you're lying to me. I need to know what's going on." She stepped closer, her voice sharp. "You need to trust me, okay? I don't have to explain myself every time I go out. Just stop." That was the breaking point. I couldn't ignore the signs any longer. She wasn't being herself, and the more I tried to confront it, the more she shut me out. It was as if the woman I loved was slipping through my fingers, and no matter how hard I grasped, she was fading away. The next few days were a blur of tension and silence. I spent hours at work, avoiding coming home, not sure what I'd find when I did. But when I did return one evening, something caught my eye. A text on her phone, a name I didn't recognize. Timur. I stared at it for a long moment before my mind even registered what I was seeing. Aysel and Timur had been texting each other late at night, and as my eyes skimmed the messages, it became clear. These weren't friendly chats. These weren't casual conversations about work or hobbies. The tone, the words, the way they spoke to each other. It was intimate. Too intimate. My stomach twisted as the realization hit me with the force of a wrecking ball. My best friend, the one I'd trusted with my life, was involved with my wife. I couldn't breathe. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I had no idea how long I stood there, just staring at the screen, trying to make sense of it all. How long had this been going on? How much had I missed? Aysel had always been the one I could rely on, the one person I thought I could trust without question. But now, in the silence of that moment, everything felt like a lie. Suddenly, I couldn't wait any longer. I had to know the truth. And the truth, no matter how painful, would finally break through the walls Aysel had been building around me. The hours after finding those texts were some of the longest of my life. I sat at the kitchen table, my mind racing in circles, unable to think straight. Timur and Aysel. Two people I'd trusted more than anyone else in the world, both betraying me in ways I hadn't thought possible. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the messages again, hoping, foolishly, that I had misunderstood. But there was no mistaking their tone. The messages were vague enough to avoid specifics but laced with familiarity and a kind of intimacy that didn't belong between friends. Words like "miss you" and "can't wait to see you again" jumped off the screen, each one slicing through my chest like a knife. The worst part was that Aysel didn't seem to be hiding these texts at all. Either she thought I'd never look or she didn't care if I found out. Both possibilities filled me with a sickening dread. I didn't confront her immediately. I needed more proof, something undeniable. So I waited. Over the next few days, I kept my eyes open, watching for anything that might confirm what I already suspected. And it didn't take long. On a Thursday evening, Aysel said she was going out for dinner with some colleagues. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice about it, but now, every excuse felt like a carefully crafted lie. As soon as she left, I decided to follow her. It wasn't something I ever imagined myself doing, sneaking around, acting like some paranoid spy, but I needed answers. I couldn't keep living in the dark. I followed her car at a distance, heart pounding as I tried to keep my headlights from giving me away. She wasn't heading toward any restaurant I recognized. Instead, she pulled into a small, dimly lit parking lot behind a boutique hotel on the edge of town. My stomach twisted as I parked a few spaces away, watching her get out and head inside. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, debating whether to go in or stay put. My mind screamed at me to leave, to turn around and forget what I'd just seen. But I couldn't. Not knowing was worse than any truth. So I got out of the car and followed her. Inside the lobby, I kept my distance, staying half hidden behind a column as I watched her speak to the receptionist. The woman handed her a key card, and Aysel headed for the elevator. I couldn't move, frozen in place as the doors closed behind her. Every nerve in my body told me to confront her right then and there, but something stopped me. I didn't want to give her the chance to lie or twist her way out of this. I needed to catch her in the act. I asked the receptionist which room Aysel had gone to, pretending I'd arrived late to join her. The woman hesitated at first, but when I showed her my wedding ring and explained we were married, she caved and told me. Room 217. I took the stairs two at a time, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. Standing outside the door, I hesitated. Part of me wanted to kick it down and end the suspense, but another part, the cowardly part, was terrified of what I might see on the other side. Taking a deep breath, I knocked. No response. I knocked again, harder this time, and after a moment, I heard shuffling inside. The door opened just a crack, and Timur's face appeared. The look on his face told me everything I needed to know. His eyes widened in shock, then narrowed in what I could only describe as guilt. "Hey man," he said, trying to act casual, but his voice trembled. "What are you doing here?" "What am I doing here?" I repeated, my voice dangerously low. "I could ask you the same thing." Before he could respond, Isel appeared behind him, her expression a mix of surprise and dread. She was wearing the same dress she'd left the house in, but her hair was slightly disheveled, and her lipstick smudged. My chest tightened at the sight, but I kept my composure. "Isel," I said, looking directly at her. "You want to explain this?" She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Timur stepped in, trying to defuse the situation. "Look, it's not what it seems." "Don't," I snapped, cutting him off. "Don't insult me with that line." Isel finally found her voice, though it came out weak and shaky. It's not what you think, okay? We were just..." "What?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Just what? Having dinner? Catching up? In a hotel room?" She flinched, guilt flashing across her face. That was all the confirmation I needed. My worst fears were true, and there was no denying it anymore. For a moment, none of us spoke. The silence stretched out, thick with tension. I looked at Timur, the man I had once considered a brother, and saw nothing but betrayal staring back at me. "You're a coward," I said to him, my voice trembling with anger. "Both of you are." Timur tried to respond, but I didn't give him the chance. I turned and walked away, ignoring Isel's pleas for me to stop. I couldn't hear her anymore. All I could hear was the pounding in my chest, the sound of everything I thought I knew collapsing around me. Back in my car, I sat in the dark for a long time, staring at the steering wheel. My hands shook as I gripped it tightly, trying to keep myself from breaking down. I felt sick, betrayed, and utterly hollow. Everything, my marriage, my friendship, my sense of stability, had been ripped away in a matter of minutes. By the time I drove home, I had made up my mind. This wasn't something I could forgive or forget. Isel and Timur had made their choices, and now it was time for me to make mine. The days that followed felt like living in a fog. The house, once a place of comfort, became suffocating. Every room reminded me of Isel, of the life we had built together, and of the lies that now tainted it all. I couldn't bear to look at her, much less talk to her, but I knew the confrontation couldn't wait forever. Isel tried to approach me the next morning, her face pale and her voice shaking. She called my name softly, as if testing the waters, but I ignored her and left the room. I wasn't ready to hear whatever excuse she had prepared, and I sure as hell wasn't ready to pretend any of this could be fixed. That evening, after work, I walked into the house and found her sitting at the kitchen table, waiting. Her eyes were red and swollen, and for a moment, I almost felt pity. Almost. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I dropped my keys on the counter and stood across from her, keeping the table between us. "Talk," I said flatly. She hesitated, wringing her hands. I don't know where to start. How about the truth?" I said, my voice cold. "You've been lying to me for months. Maybe years. Start there." She winced but didn't deny it. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she began. "Timur and we didn't plan this. It just happened." I scoffed. "It just happened. That's the best you can come up with." Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't care. She wasn't the victim here. "I never wanted to hurt you," she continued, her voice breaking. "You have to believe me." "Believe you?" I snapped, my anger finally boiling over. "You want me to believe the same woman who lied to my face? Who's been sneaking around with my best friend behind my back? Tell me, Isel, how long has this been going on?" She looked down, her hands trembling. A few months, she admitted. It started after that fight we had about me working late. I felt so distant from you, and Timur he was there. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. So, it's my fault? I asked, my voice rising. You felt distant, so you decided to sleep with my best friend? It wasn't like that, she said quickly, her tears falling freely now. I was confused, and I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. But it didn't mean anything. It's over now. It didn't mean anything? I repeated, laughing bitterly. Isel, you don't sneak off to hotel rooms with someone if it doesn't mean anything. You don't destroy your marriage for nothing. She opened her mouth to respond, but I cut her off. And Timur? I asked. What about him? Did it mean anything to him? Or was this just a game the two of you played while I was too stupid to notice? She didn't answer, and her silence was all I needed to know. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her sobbing at the table. I didn't care. I couldn't care. The woman I had loved, the woman I thought I knew, was gone. The next confrontation was with Timur. I couldn't let him get away with this, not without looking him in the eye and making him face what he'd done. I called him the following day and told him to meet me at the office after hours. He sounded hesitant, but I didn't give him a choice. When he walked into the conference room, his usual cocky demeanor was gone. He looked nervous, like a kid about to get caught. Good. Michael, he started, but I held up a hand to stop him. Don't, I said sharply. Don't even say my name. You don't get to talk your way out of this. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know I screwed up. I don't know what else to say. You don't know what else to say. I repeated, my voice dripping with contempt. How about explaining how you thought it was okay to stab me in the back? How about telling me why my best friend decided to destroy my life? It wasn't about you, he said weakly, avoiding my gaze. It just happened. There it is again, I said bitterly. It just happened. Like you tripped and fell into my wife's bed. Look, I know there's nothing I can say to make this right, he said, his voice trembling. But I swear, I never wanted to hurt you. You're my brother, Michael. Don't call me that, I snapped, my fists clenching at my sides. You're no brother of mine. Timur looked like he was about to say something, but I didn't give him the chance. I leaned forward, my voice low and steady. You're a coward. A pathetic excuse for a man. And you don't deserve anything you have. His face paled, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. Good. Let him feel it. This is done, I continued. Our friendship. Our business partnership. Everything. Done. I didn't wait for his response. I grabbed my things and left, leaving him standing there in stunned silence. As I walked out of the building, a sense of clarity washed over me. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something new. Something that didn't include Isel or Timur. But before I could move forward, there was one more thing I had to do. I had to make sure that Timur felt the full weight of what he'd done. And I knew exactly how to do it. It's strange how quickly anger can turn into cold, calculated resolve. After my confrontations with Isel and Timur, the emotional whirlwind inside me settled into something sharper, an edge of determination. If they thought they could walk away from this without consequences, they were dead wrong. They had shattered my life, and I wasn't going to let them move forward unscathed. The first step in my plan was the company. Timur and I had built it together from the ground up. It was our shared success story, but it had always been more than that to me. It was a legacy, a symbol of hard work and trust. Now that trust was gone, and I couldn't stomach the idea of working with him, of even being in the same room as him. I had to cut ties, but not in a way that would let him benefit. Enter Gary Linton. If Timur was the bold, charismatic partner in our company, Gary was the exact opposite. Calculated, ruthless, and someone Timur absolutely despised. Years ago, Gary had tried to poach our biggest client, and since then, he'd been a thorn in Timur's side, always circling, waiting for an opportunity to strike. I decided to give him one. It didn't take much to arrange a meeting with Gary. He was eager when I called, and we met at a quiet cafe on the edge of town. As I sat across from him, laying out my offer, I could see the gears turning in his head. "You're serious about this?" he asked, leaning forward. "You're willing to sell your shares to me? Just like that?" "Not just like that," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "I have conditions. First, you take over my shares and management duties immediately. I don't want anything tying me to the company once this is done." Gary nodded, a smirk playing on his lips. "And the second?" "You make Timur's life hell," I said bluntly. "Freeze him out of major decisions. Undermine him. Take the company in a direction that forces him out, or at least sidelines him. Do whatever you need to do." Gary's grin widened. "You're giving me a lot of freedom here, Michael. I didn't think you had it in you to play dirty." "I didn't," I admitted, my voice cold. "Until now." The deal was finalized within weeks. Gary wasted no time asserting his dominance, calling an emergency board meeting and announcing his plans for a strategic restructuring of the company. Timur was blindsided. I wasn't there to see it, but I heard about it from a few mutual contacts. Apparently, Gary took great pleasure in explaining how his leadership would correct the inefficiencies Timur had allowed to fester. By the time I handed over my official resignation, Timur's hold on the company was already slipping. He called me several times, his messages alternating between anger and desperation, but I ignored them all. There was nothing left to say. Next, I turned my attention to Isel. She had been quiet since our last conversation, giving me space, or maybe just biding her time. But I knew her well enough to predict her next move. She would try to fix things, to convince me that we could move past this. And I couldn't let that happen. When she finally approached me, it was late one evening, as I sat in the living room, staring at the walls. She walked in hesitantly, holding a folder in her hands. I thought we could talk," she said softly. "About us." "There is no us, Isel," I said without looking at her. She flinched at my words but pressed on, sitting down across from me. "I know I've hurt you, and I know it might be impossible to make things right, but I want to try. I love you, Michael. I've always loved you." "Don't," I said sharply, finally meeting her gaze. "Don't say you love me. If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this. You wouldn't have betrayed me." Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't let her speak. "This marriage is over," I continued. "I've already spoken to a lawyer. The divorce papers will be ready soon." "Michael, please," she said, her voice breaking. "Don't throw everything away. We can go to counseling. We can fix this." I shook my head. "No, Isel. I'm not interested in fixing something that you destroyed. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine." She started to argue, but I held up a hand to stop her. "I want you out of the house by the end of the month," I said firmly. "I don't care where you go, but you can't stay here." The look on her face was a mixture of anger and despair, but I didn't waver. She had already taken enough from me. I wasn't about to let her take my dignity too. The days that followed were a strange mix of liberation and grief. As much as I hated Isel and Timur for what they had done, there was still a part of me that mourned the life I thought I had. The marriage, the partnership, the future I had envisioned, it was all gone. But there was also a sense of clarity. For the first time in months, I felt like I was in control of my life again. I wasn't just reacting to the pain. I was taking steps to move forward, to rebuild. As for Isel and Timur, they would have to live with the consequences of their actions. Isel moved out of the house, and Timur's position at the company continued to crumble under Gary's reign. Neither of them would walk away unscathed, and that thought brought me a small, bitter sense of satisfaction. But I knew this was just the beginning. Rebuilding my life wouldn't happen overnight, and there were still challenges ahead. But for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face them. The morning I met with my lawyer felt like crossing a threshold I couldn't step back over. I'd never imagined sitting across from someone and discussing the end of my marriage, but there I was, explaining everything. Isel's affair, the texts, the confrontation in that hotel. The lawyer, a composed and sharp-eyed woman named Clara, listened carefully, taking notes as I spoke. When I finished, She leaned back in her chair and gave me a look that was equal parts sympathy and professionalism. "This isn't going to be easy," she said, her voice steady. "But given the circumstances, we can work toward an outcome that's fair to you." "Fair," I repeated, the word bitter on my tongue. What does fair even mean now? She didn't answer, and I didn't press her. Fair didn't matter. Justice didn't matter. What mattered was getting through this with as little collateral damage as possible. I wasn't interested in dragging things out or making a spectacle. I just wanted it over. Isel didn't take the news well. I served her the papers on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. She was sitting in the living room, flipping through an old photo album, probably hoping to stir up nostalgia, to remind me of the good times. When I handed her the envelope, her face fell, and for a moment, I thought she might rip it up. "You're really doing this," she said, her voice hollow. "Yes," I replied, my tone leaving no room for argument. Tears welled in her eyes, but I felt nothing. Not pity, not anger, just emptiness. "Michael, please, don't do this. We can still work things out." "We can't," I said firmly. "This isn't something we can fix, Isel. It's over." She tried to plead with me, her voice breaking as she recounted all the good memories we shared, all the reasons she thought we could rebuild. But every word felt like a lie. She wasn't fighting for me or for our marriage. She was fighting for her comfort, for the life she'd taken for granted. When she realized I wasn't budging, her tone shifted. The tears turned to anger, her voice rising as she accused me of giving up too easily. "You're being stubborn," she snapped. "You're throwing away everything we've built because of one mistake." "One mistake," I repeated, my voice colder than I intended. "Isel, you didn't trip and fall into an affair. You lied to me. You betrayed me. You made a series of choices that destroyed our marriage. Don't stand there and act like I'm the one throwing this away." Her anger deflated as quickly as it had flared, and she sank back into the couch, clutching the envelope in her hands. For the first time, I saw resignation in her eyes. She knew this was the end. The divorce process was as draining as I expected. There were endless meetings, negotiations, and paperwork. Clara was a godsend, cutting through the noise and keeping me focused on the practicalities. We divided the assets with as little drama as possible. Isel took her car and some personal belongings, while I kept the house. She wanted more, but Clara's sharp negotiation skills left her with little room to argue. Throughout it all, Isel made several attempts to reach out. She'd leave notes in the mailbox, send me texts late at night, and even show up unannounced when she thought I'd be home. At first, her messages were apologetic, begging for a second chance. When those didn't work, she tried a different angle, reminding me of the love we once shared, trying to spark some semblance of the bond we'd lost. But it was too late. Whatever love I'd felt for her had been buried under the weight of her betrayal. One evening, not long after the divorce was finalized, Isel came by to pick up the last of her things. She lingered in the doorway, her hands gripping the box she carried. "I hope one day you can forgive me," she said quietly. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw a stranger. "Maybe," I said, though I didn't mean it. Forgiveness wasn't on the horizon. Not yet, maybe not ever. She nodded, her eyes searching mine for something I couldn't give her. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. I stood in the doorway, watching her leave, and felt an odd sense of relief. The chapter was closed. The pain wasn't gone, and I knew it wouldn't be for a long time, but at least the wound was no longer fresh. I could begin to heal. After the divorce, life felt strange. The house was quieter, emptier. At first, I avoided certain rooms: the kitchen, where we used to cook together, the bedroom, where her absence felt like a weight pressing down on me. But gradually, I began to reclaim those spaces, making them my own again. I threw myself into my work, taking on new projects and pushing myself harder than ever. It was a welcome distraction, but it wasn't enough. The nights were the hardest, when the silence became unbearable and the memories crept in. That was when I started to focus on something else: myself. I joined a gym, started eating healthier, and picked up old hobbies I'd abandoned over the years. Slowly but surely, I began to feel like myself again. Not the man I was before the betrayal, but someone new. Someone stronger. The divorce had taken its toll, but it also gave me something I hadn't expected. Freedom. Freedom to rebuild my life on my terms, without the weight of Isil's lies dragging me down. It wasn't an easy road, and there were moments when the loneliness felt unbearable. But with every step forward, I felt a little lighter, a little more like the man I wanted to be. Timur and Isil became ghosts of my past, reminders of a life I'd left behind. I didn't care what happened to them or their relationship. All that mattered was that I was free. And for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. Rebuilding your life after betrayal feels like walking through a field littered with broken glass. Every step hurts, but stopping isn't an option. In the weeks and months after the divorce, I forced myself to keep moving forward, even when it felt like I was dragging the weight of everything I'd lost behind me. My career, which had once been my pride and joy, became my anchor. With Timur out of the picture, I had to decide what came next. The first order of business was reclaiming my professional life. Selling my shares to Gary had been a calculated move to cut Timur out, but it had also left me in unfamiliar territory. For the first time in years, I wasn't tied to the company I had built. At first, that realization felt like another loss, another reminder of everything I had sacrificed. But the more I thought about it, the more I saw it as an opportunity. One evening, as I stared at the empty walls of my home office, the idea struck me. I could start over. I could build something new, something that was mine and mine alone. I had the experience, the connections, and, thanks to the deal with Gary, the financial stability to make it happen. Over the next few weeks, I poured myself into the project. I sketched out plans, made phone calls, and reached out to old colleagues who might be interested in joining me. It wasn't long before I had the framework of a new engineering firm, a company that would reflect my values and vision. Naming it was the hardest part. I didn't want to use my name or anything that tied me to the past. After days of deliberation, I settled on Phoenix Structures. It felt fitting, a symbol of rising from the ashes, of turning destruction into something stronger. While work gave me purpose, the personal side of my life was harder to rebuild. The nights were still lonely, and the silence of the house often felt like a weight pressing down on me. Friends tried to help, inviting me out for drinks or offering to set me up with someone, but I wasn't ready. I wasn't even sure I'd ever be ready. And then there was Maria. Maria and I had worked together briefly a few years earlier. She was sharp, driven, and one of the few people in the industry who wasn't intimidated by Gary's ruthless reputation. When I reached out to her about Phoenix Structures, she didn't hesitate. "I'm in," she said over the phone, her voice filled with excitement. At first, our interactions were strictly professional. We met to discuss strategy, budgets, and client acquisition. But as the weeks went on, I found myself looking forward to our meetings for reasons that had nothing to do with work. Maria had a way of making everything feel lighter, her quick wit and unshakable confidence cutting through the tension that seemed to cling to me like a second skin. One evening, after a particularly long meeting, we ended up sitting in a nearly empty diner, sharing a late-night meal. Maria leaned back in her chair, studying me with a curious expression. "You're different than I remember," she said, her tone more thoughtful than teasing. "Different how?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. She shrugged. "More serious. Like you're carrying something heavy." I hesitated, unsure how much to share. But there was something about Maria that made honesty feel safe. "It's been a rough year," I admitted. "I'm trying to rebuild, but some days it feels like I'm just putting on a good show." Maria nodded, her expression softening. "Rebuilding isn't easy," she said. "But you're doing it. That counts for something." Her words stayed with me long after that night. I wasn't sure what was happening between us, but for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of something I thought I'd lost. Hope. As the months passed, Phoenix Structures began to take off. We landed a few key clients early on, and the team I'd assembled proved to be as dedicated and capable as I'd hoped. Maria became my right hand, her insight and determination driving the company forward. On the personal front, things were slower, more tentative. Maria and I grew closer, but neither of us rushed into anything. She understood my need for space, for time to heal, and I respected her for it. We spent more time together outside of work, grabbing coffee, going for walks, or simply talking about life. It was easy, natural, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. One evening, as we sat on a park bench overlooking the city, Maria turned to me with a small smile. "You know, I don't think I've ever seen you this relaxed," she said. I chuckled. "That's because I haven't been this relaxed in years." She tilted her head, her gaze searching mine. "You've come a long way, Michael. You should be proud of yourself." I looked out at the city lights, the weight of her words settling over me. "I wouldn't have made it this far without you," I said honestly. Maria's smile widened, and for the first time, I allowed myself to imagine what the future might look like, with her in it. Rebuilding wasn't easy, and there were still days when the past felt like a shadow lurking at the edges of my mind. But with every step forward, the shadow grew smaller, and the future felt brighter. I wasn't the same man I'd been before the betrayal, but maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. I was stronger now, more resilient, and I had people in my corner who believed in me. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. The day I officially opened the doors to Phoenix Structures felt like stepping into a new chapter of my life. The office was small, nestled on the top floor of a modest building downtown, but it was ours. My team, people I trusted, people who believed in the vision, stood beside me, their excitement contagious. Maria, as always, was at the center of it, her sharp eyes scanning the room to make sure everything was perfect. "This is just the beginning," she said as we toasted with cheap champagne in plastic cups. "We're going to build something incredible." Looking around the room, I believed her. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was standing on solid ground, ready to move forward. As the months went by, life began to take on a new rhythm. Work consumed my days, and in many ways, it was exactly what I needed. A purpose, a distraction, a chance to prove to myself that I could rise above everything I'd been through. But it wasn't just work that brought me back to life. Maria had become more than just a colleague. She was my partner in every sense of the word. We didn't label our relationship at first. There was no need. What mattered was the way she made me feel, like the weight of the past wasn't mine to carry alone. She didn't push me to talk about Isel or Timur, but when I did, she listened without judgment. Her presence was steady, grounding, and exactly what I needed. One night, as we sat on the couch in her apartment, the city lights glowing through the window, I found myself telling her things I hadn't told anyone, not even myself. About the anger, the guilt, the moments when I questioned whether I'd made the right choices. She didn't interrupt or try to fix it. She just let me speak. When I finished, she reached for my hand, her fingers warm against mine. "You didn't deserve what happened to you," she said quietly. "But you came out stronger. That's what matters." Her words stayed with me long after I left that night. Maria had a way of seeing through the walls I put up, of reminding me that even the hardest experiences could lead to something better. In time, I stopped thinking about Isel and Timur. They became distant figures, part of a story that no longer defined me. I didn't know what had happened to them, whether they stayed together or fell apart, and I didn't care. My life was no longer tied to theirs, and that realization brought a sense of freedom I hadn't known I needed. Maria and I eventually became something more official, though it happened so naturally that it felt inevitable. She had a knack for bringing light into my life, whether it was through her quick wit, her unwavering support, or the simple joy of her company. We started making plans, not just for Phoenix Structures, but for the future we wanted to build together. One sunny afternoon, as we strolled through the park near her apartment, Maria stopped suddenly and turned to me, a thoughtful expression on her face. "What is it?" I asked, smiling at her curiosity. She hesitated, then grinned. "I was just thinking. This is the happiest I've been in a long time." I felt a warmth in my chest, a sense of peace that had been missing for far too long. "Me too," I said, and I meant it. The path I'd walked to get here hadn't been easy. There were scars, memories that would never fully fade, but they no longer held me back. They were reminders of what I'd overcome, of the strength I'd found in the face of betrayal. Phoenix Structures grew steadily, each project a testament to the resilience and determination of the team behind it. Maria and I became partners in every way, and for the first time, I allowed myself to dream of a future filled with possibility. One evening, as we sat on the balcony of our shared apartment, watching the sun set over the city, Maria leaned her head on my shoulder. "Do you ever think about what might have been?" she asked softly. I considered her question, letting the silence stretch between us. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but not the way I used to." I think about how different things could have been. And then I realize I wouldn't trade where I am now for anything. Maria smiled, her hand slipping into mine. Good, she said. Because I think we've got something worth holding on to. And she was right. My journey wasn't perfect, and it wasn't without pain, but it had brought me here. To a place where I could rebuild, where I could trust again, and where I could find happiness, not in spite of the past, but because of what it had taught me. It was a new beginning, one I hadn't expected, but one I wouldn't trade for anything. And for the first time in years, I felt ready to face whatever came next, knowing that the strength I'd found would carry me forward.